Sarah Lewis, the author, is the founder of Vision and Justice and the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Humanities and Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. She's the author of the bestseller, The Rise, Creativity, The Gift of Failure, and The Search for Mastery, and editor of the award-winning volumes Vision and Justice and the anthology on the work of Carrie Mae Weems. Lewis's awards include the Infinity Award, the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Cullman Fellowship, the Freedom Scholar Award, and the Arthur Danto ASA Prize from the American Philosophical Association, and the Photography Network Book Prize. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Harvard University, a Master's in Philosophy from Oxford University, a Master's in Arts from the Courtauld Institute of Art, and her PhD from Yale University. She lives in New York City and Cambridge. The Unseeing Truth draws on abundant scholarship to show that images contributed to Americans' conception of race from the Civil War through the Jim Crow era. She focuses particularly on the connection made between whiteness and the Caucasus, a region that waged a war against Russian incursion from 1817 to 1864. Americans were hugely sympathetic to the Caucasus, which a prominent 18th century German naturalist had argued was the homeland of racial whiteness. In a society consumed by the urgent need to shore up the idea of race, Caucasian came to be conflated with white, a concept that persisted despite stark visual evidence to the contrary. Images of the Caucasus circulating after the Civil War revealed a racially mixed population. And by 1876, another conflict recast the region as Muslim and Asian, a place filled with alien racial elements. Nevertheless, the definition of Caucasian as European white at the pinnacle of the racial hierarchy was underscored by many, including Woodrow Wilson. Kirkus Reviews calls Sarah's book a fresh, authoritative historical inquiry. Lewis will be in conversation with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, National Book Award-winning author of 15 books for adults and children, including 9 New York Times bestsellers. Dr. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. He's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News racial justice contributor. Dr. Kendi is the author of Stamped from the Beginning, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, making him the youngest author ever to win that award. He also authored the international bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which was described in the New York Times as the most courageous book to date on the problem of race in the Western mind. He was awarded a 2021 MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Grant. So without further ado, we're going to have our author and moderator take the stage.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Oh, family and friends, and oh my goodness, beautiful. Great to be here.
It is, and I'm truly honored to be able to sit before everyone and just have a conversation about your book. And I should say, I wrote a book that chronicled the history of racist ideas. And as I read this book, I was so upset that I didn't have this book to draw from. And I should also add, I the willingness and the ability to document what is not seen as part of this history, is just truly brilliant. And I think is hopefully going to open up a whole new wave of scholarship, on this topic. And I guess let's start there, if I may. You very early on in the text, Sarah, you write about how racial fictions were sort of carved into the American psyche through removals. Can you talk about how that happened?
Well, thank you for the honor of your comment, your presence with me here today, and for seeing so clearly the intervention I hope to make with the Unseen Truth. This project does address what we often fail to see, which is that we don't and haven't cohered this regime of racial hierarchy that we're still struggling to undo through declaration alone, through the force of stereotype, through insistence, but most forcefully, I think, have done so through strategic negation, through excision, through taking out from view, whether it's in pedagogy and textbooks or the very truth that people would need to access to dismantle the regime, right? So I came across this in so many different, and of course over the conversation we'll engage with the different iterations that I decided to write this book. The main myth that's been taken out of these conversations is the myth underneath the entire regime of racial formation. It's all based on a fiction, right? The entire thing. And we instinctively know this. I think we all have a sense that this can't be right, that there's no justification for any group being superior to another, but there is a moment in American culture in the 19th century during the Civil War when you see that it was known to be a fiction. And society, willfully, deliberately looked away from the evidence and created, to cover that up, the regime we live with today. And that was done through negation, through excision, right? So that's one, the overview to think about that idea, and we can maybe talk about the specific examples, but I was just so stunned when I came across the evidence of this work that I decided to write. Yeah.
And I suspect maybe some of you here have identified as Caucasian or identified someone as Caucasian, even though, correct me if I'm wrong, that area of Europe is predominantly Muslim, is not even part of the European Union right now. So how did we get from a place where white people were and still are identifying as Caucasian, but that place that's considered the sort of cradle of white people, the cradle of whiteness, isn't even part of the European Union, let alone is considered to be a part of the white world?
So you ready? Okay. We use this term Caucasian as a cognate for racial whiteness. How did this come into being? Well, I'm not the first to write about this, but this part, we need to make sure we all have the same set of facts, and then we can start to discuss. So German naturalist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach defines this category based on things that would seem so specious now that we'd laugh at it, but at the time were considered data. The so-called beauty of the women from the region, the symmetry of the skulls, the biblical lore of the region, the mythological lore of the region, all cohered to legitimate this idea that the Caucasus region between the Black and Caspian Sea, where in Genesis, chapter of the Bible, states Noah's Ark came to rest, was the so-called homeland of whiteness. And that passed muster for decades in the 19th century as fact. And not just homeland of whiteness, but the homeland of the most pure, the most superior racial type on earth. Historians to date have mainly seen the fact that that was false as a kind of footnote of racial formation. Oh, they got it wrong, but that's okay because we kept it moving anyway and it's all right. But we've overlooked the consequence of that fabrication.
Including me. Yes.
We all apparently have, and I had too until I paused long enough to say, okay, you know what, we need to write this book. So there's a whole war that takes place during the same time as the American Civil War that exposes the fiction of this term and drives a heart of concern and into the racial project. The Caucasian War. This takes place, you heard in the introduction, between 1817 and 1864. It results in the genocide of the peoples of the Caucasus region. It's Russia's attempt to gain control over the Black Sea region, pushing out the Ottoman Empire. The reporting on that, because of the racial lore of this region, exposes the truth of who's really there, which effectively people saw had nothing to do with whiteness at all. The most famed showman of the era, P.T. Barnum, gets wind of this. He creates a spectacle called the Circassian Beauty. A woman who's a so-called exemplar of white racial purity from the Caucasus region is mounted on stage, becomes his most popular performer. And her whole look challenges the idea of the term Caucasian, the idea of racial whiteness. And it's one example of the many throughout the book in which you see people grappling with the fiction of this idea, the fact that they had been duped into believing it, and the nervousness that there's complete and utter instability in the racial regime and hierarchy that was being instantiated through slavery, Jim Crow rule, and segregation today. So that's the heart of it. Should we show one picture of I want to make sure. Okay, so this is the Circassian Beauty that P.T. Barnum mounts on stages. She looks with her alabaster skin a bit like, say, Angela Davis in terms of her afro. And she's...
We weren't making this up, right?
We were not making this up. No, we got to show them the evidence. So I found this in the archive and thought it was maybe a one-off, but realized that they're a constellation of these images because they're so popular. I showed an image of another Circassian Beauty performer to Kathleen Cleaver in my office one day, and you're seeing her here. I'm shocked about that. So they start to look like this over time, and yeah, those are the Circassian Beauties. So this is the beginning, the foundation of the motive of the time in which we question the term Caucasian, right? And we still live with it as a relic of this fiction. We've used other terms, Aryan, Anglo-Saxon, but the fact that it was a fiction really necessitated other means to stabilize the regime of racial domination.
And what's interesting is around the same time that Blumenbach was sort of connecting whiteness to Caucasian, there was a man named Henry Moss, who, this was in the 1790s, he was exhibited, particularly in Philadelphia, and many prominent Americans came to see him. Someone like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, who was a founding father. And Henry Moss had vitiligo. So his darker skin was whitening. And at the time, there were these theories that suggested that the original humans were white, that Adam and Eve were white, the Garden of Eden was in Europe, and Black people at some point became Black through the sun. And so one of the ways in which we could make everyone equal and thereby human and white again was through Black people literally migrating to cooler climates. And so Henry Moss was exhibited to demonstrate the potential for racial progress. And I'm mentioning this because, as you just sort of stated, there were things that were needed to stabilize these racial fictions. Is that an example?
It is an extraordinary example. When I was reading Stamp from the beginning and I was in process with the Unseen Truth, I would look at the extraordinary examples and quality of your mind and think, I can't wait for us to be in conversation about this work. This is such a clear and great example. What it also speaks to is the force and function of culture and performance for stating unspeakable truths, right, in American life. We often think of, when we discuss racial justice, the work of law primarily in politics, and leave out the arts, and culture as if it only documents what's taking place. But really, to understand the origins of how we got here, we need to take seriously these performances, such as the one you're describing, because these are performances that occupy the work of our founding fathers that really shook up the calcified ideas about race that were forming. So vitiligo, the just natural instances of how human beings were created, really challenged the stability of racial hierarchy. And fascinated me as I was researching this project. The Circassian Beauties are just one example of this broader phenomenon, right?
And one of the people you documented who recognized the criticality of the arts was, of course, Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
And you write in the book that, quote, he understood that political representation would be closely tied to representation itself.
Yes.
How we see through symbols, images, and the full cultural landscape in American life. He knew that politics is inextricably tied to how we see each other and, quite literally, how we fail to see each other.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that?
Frederick Douglass would be not just so thrilled we're here tonight, but anticipated that we would be here tonight. Truly, he is the first theorist of the image and visual culture, broadly defined, for the work of justice, specifically racial justice in the United States. And he writes this speech, Pictures in Progress, as you know, during the Civil War, when no one expected him to focus on the work of culture. He does so because of we could have a whole seminar about why he's doing this. He's doing this because of the new medium of technology that's been created and how it democratizes portraiture, but he's also doing it because he understands that racial scientists are using imagery to cohere these fictions as fact, right? He's writing in a way to describe not only the force and function of culture for racial justice, but also in an attempt to show how we can shift perspectives, right, through representation itself. He anticipates that we would understand how narratives are constructed through culture and come to see their importance. He says at the end of the speech that over 150 years later, we might still be grappling with this idea. That's why I think of all of us here today. So Frederick Douglass became, as I was focusing on the unseen truth and vision and justice, a real touchstone for this project. Yeah.
And you've also documented how he was the most photographed American in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, you write that what was critical to living in a truly democratic society was to be seen as we see ourselves and to see others as they wish to be seen.
Yeah.
And, as I reflect particularly on this moment in time, we're in the midst of a campaign. Did y'all know about that? And as I reflect on different groups in this country, I guess how would you reflect on that? Particularly thinking about how Frederick Douglass would be sort of thinking about this particular political moment.
God. He is the most photographed American man in the 19th century. I'm not sure how many of you knew that. I did not know that until my colleagues John Stauffer, Celeste Marie Bernier, and Zoe Trod discovered this. Not African American man, American man. Right? Why? He understood the power of representation itself in a representational democracy. He understood that the, I think, unspeakable tension, as you so well know, between slavery and freedom at our founding would require more than argument alone to shift people's perception of who counts and who belongs in society. Slavery dehumanized the gaze. He understood this. He understood it was going to require a jolt, a force, a counter narrative to change people's perceptions of African Americans in particular. Douglass states in this speech, Pictures in Progress, that he redrafts 3 times over the course of his life, that in the political process, this is nearly a direct quote. I don't want to state that it is because I'm not going to butcher his words, but in the political process, he says, politics begins it, but the picture gallery ends it. And I read that countless times and thought, oh my God, he's here right now. He understands where we would be and how critical the image would become. I think of it as I was hearing from so many pundits and journalists frustration over Vice President Kamala Harris not speaking to the public and letting it affect her own words, but the image of her speak, right, at these different events. And I think we have underestimated the force and function of visual representation in our politics. I think we're just beginning to grasp how impactful it is. This is a long narrative war we've been in, because of the fiction of racial domination and the force of slavery. And I do think that we are in a moment where we're asking ourselves if we're willing to let fictions go so that we can actually claim and know that we're all entitled to the full empowerment of our dreams and our lives. And that's what I think, for me, the presidential election represents, this question: do we have the will to let it go?
Exactly. And, shifting gears a little bit, you also chronicled the presidency of Woodrow Wilson.
Yes.
And what's striking is, as I was reading this chapter, I thought about the iconic image of the sort of whites only sign.
Yeah.
And I thought about those images in contrast to the segregation that Wilson created, in the federal government. Can you speak a little bit to that? I'm sure you know where I'm going.
Of course. So this is another myth I think we need to expose. I'm sure everyone here has an image in their mind of segregation and the signs associated with it. Whites only signs, no colored. What startled me was, in researching Woodrow Wilson's regime, the president who instantiated segregation in the federal administration, he did not use these signs. He did not instantiate federal segregation through outright decree. There was no public declaration of this fact, to the point where secretaries of different departments didn't know that segregation was taking place until they arrived, saw desks being moved at instructions of those who they hadn't been in contact with. This was a clandestine operation, and designed deliberately so by Wilson and his lieutenants to be as such. It was a regime that inaugurated the ability to enact with impunity, right, this regime of racial domination in utter silence. The instructions were for federal administrators to not put anything in writing regarding segregation in the federal government, to only speak verbally about it. I, in the book, chronicle the diary and letters of Charles Hamlin, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, whose diaries give you a sense of just how bewildering it was for those who saw the injustice taking place. But I think most heartbreaking to see were the lives and the evidence of this recognition of what was taking place on the part of the Black clerks. Imagine entering the administration believing that you had escaped the noose of Jim Crow rule and had a meritocracy, right, in your environment, that you could rise in station. And then no one quite tells you explicitly, but all of a sudden you just can't. All of a sudden you just, no matter what happens, how good you are, you simply. And that is insidious. But that is also a regime of administration that Wilson was conscious of creating, that offers us the scaffolding we need to understand why silent signals are still used today, why dog whistling has become a tactic. You're able to see the roots of this regime. There.
Yes. Yeah, because I suspect many people can relate to walking into an institution thinking that it's committed to diversity or anti-racism and finding out very quickly
Right.
otherwise. You also had a very fascinating discussion of a particular lynching photo, and you described, and I should say sort of documented, someone else who noticed how the lynching photograph telegraphed, and I'm quoting you, a visual rule of unseeing.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Yeah. So racial regimes in the United States were cohered through a transformation of vision. Like, if we leave out the role of perception and vision, we're missing, I think, everything for the work of racial justice. And the racial terror of lynching is the most clear example of that fact. So in the example, we're going to dispense with professor and professor, we decided. So the example Ibram citing is of one of, I think, the most well-known photographs of lynching to those who are familiar with the history of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith and Marion, Indiana. It's a double lynching. What's most chilling about the photograph, as my students at Harvard all notice, is what's happening in the foreground. Men and women, children, who are engaged with the lynching as a spectacle, because these were publicly celebrated acts of municipal control to maintain racial domination, are looking back at the camera as if nothing is wrong, that they're not, in fact, accessories to double murder, which is what they are, right? The extraordinary artist, Kerry James Marshall, makes that point with an artwork that he creates based on the work. And he's addressing the term unseeing, that you're asking about. He's getting us to see what we have looked at but chosen to disregard, which is our own complicity culturally, right, in normalizing racial terror. And as he brilliantly deals with the legacy and lineage that we're all within. I won't spoil that for those who are going to read it. But yes.
Yeah, and it was interesting because as I looked into some of the faces staring back at the camera, I couldn't help but think about Derek Chauvin. So if you remember the, Derek Chauvin's murder of George Floyd, and he's looking, at the camera. It's essentially how some of these, particularly some of these men, were looking, at the camera. So in order to rectify this, you in many ways call for what you call representational justice.
Yes.
What is that?
Yes. So the power of representation and a representational democracy for justice can't be underestimated. Why? Law and norms follows the narratives, right, that representation offers us and the foundation that it sets. Representational justice is achieved not only through the work of the artists that we've referenced, but by the decisions that we make to showcase who we are through cultural decisions of all kinds. So representational justice, I see it in the work of us being here together today. I see it in the work that takes place in museum practices and in classrooms where I'm actually ensuring that we represent the full history of the United States without lying about it. It's a full range of how we can conceive of the term representation, but increasingly I want to ensure people see it as outside of just the realm of the arts and more in the realm of whatever constitutes the narratives that we live with each day. There's an image that might make this vivid. I think many of you will know it. There's a photograph of a young boy in the Obama White House who's touching President Obama's head. And that photograph is, the young boy is with his parents. He's being given a chance to ask one question of the president. And this image, I think he asks him, is my hair texture really the same as yours? Right? And he leans down to let him touch the evidence. But why does he need evidence that he can be the president, right? At that young age of 5, what narratives has he been surrounded by such that he feels even then the precarity of his dreams, right? That's to me an example of how urgent this narrative work is, today. Yeah.
And is it also, for those of us who visit sort of artistic institutions, one of the things I should say is after reading this book, I feel like every time I go to a museum or other cultural institution, I'm going to look to see what I don't see.
There you go. I
Is,
love
is that part of it?
Please do. Oh my gosh. Well, we could have a whole separate talk about exactly that. And next time you go to a museum, I hope we go together.
Okay.
What we're failing to see, I mean, I myself, trained as an art historian, I almost missed the very work of art that prompted me to write the book. It was a work that's titled Circassian. It was once called Caucasian Soldier. It's one of the first works that enters the Museum of Fine Arts Boston's collection. And it was just nested up so high on the wall that I almost walked past it, and then realized I was looking at the keystone for understanding the work of Unseeing itself. How I just disregarded the fact that we all walk around accepting this fiction, you know. There's a representation of a man from the Caucasus region. We call him Caucasian Soldier, but he looks nothing like and has no representational connection to the idea of whiteness. The Metropolitan Museum, I walked past in the Arms and Armor collection, which I will admit I'm never really in, but I just did a little detour. And there's a whole section of Caucasian armor on display. And I thought, wait, okay. They're banking on the fact that I trust that they don't mean white armor. Okay, so we accept that we are just going to live with these fictions and keep it moving, you know? So there's a lot of, that's an implicit agreement between the curator and the viewer, the curator and the American public, but it excavates the unstable foundation of the entire regime of racial hierarchy. You know?
Indeed, and you also encourage us to have what you call deeper moments of racial recognition.
Yeah.
And you know, even before you speak about that, it when I read that, I thought about even my work and how I've encouraged Americans to see racist policies when they're seeing racial inequities and disparities, and the level of pushback I've received by just that simple overture, as opposed to getting Americans seeing a particular racial group as inferior when they see racial inequities. So how do we sort of arrive? How do we have these deeper moments of racial recognition?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a fearlessness required to stare with a kind of endurance at a fiction that's created the whole foundation of American society. I found myself just wondering if we were going to be able to really stand it, if writing the book was going to matter. You know, there are moments in which I realized I had to do this work. In reading your work, I thought, okay, this is a continuation of the conversation, perhaps an addition. Nell Painter's work, The History of White People, all of these works have grappled with topics surrounding this. But I think one of the questions I'm asking is, can we finally have the will to look at what has created the brutality, right, of the regime? You know, just bear with me for a minute. I was thinking of this on the way. You know, when we're young and we're warned about brutality, say someone being a bully, right? We're often told that it's because they don't really believe, you know, in themselves or what they're doing. There's something wrong, all right, there. And I've come to see, as an analogy, the regime that we've lived with and its brutality regarding racial policy that way. It only has to be that brutal because it's covering up a lie, right? So once we accept that, then I think, at least for me, I found more willingness to look at those lies, to look at those fictions, and kind of started to delight in pointing them out. Because once you see them, it becomes more a question of political will, you know, and we can muster that, I think.
And I meant to speak to this earlier, but I want to go back to it.
Sure.
So one of the fascinating findings in your book is you documented how at the turn of the 20th century, embalmers
Yes.
had started to struggle because it became harder to keep a body white,
Right. Right.
particularly for the funeral.
I love
Can you?
it.
And so they had to figure out
Yep.
how to maintain that fiction. If you could speak to that.
Oh, Ibram Kendi, of course, came with it. The part of the book.
I'm sorry.
I so needed to get into the book and realize was the evidence. During the Civil War, embalmers began for the first time to advertise their capacity to keep a body white. Okay, so there's a whole dissertation written on this that I happen to have read for the book, Drew Faust's book. Of course, this Death in the Republic of Suffering pointed me to it. But that speaks to this nervousness and sense that there's no stability to the idea of racial domination. So imagine bodies, as we know, strewn on fields and houses. People would come home and realize what had taken place, and the bodies had turned black, white bodies, which only revealed the inability to maintain a line of racial demarcation, right? After life has expired, which states, of course, that the whole thing is made up. Embalmers, the evidence, it takes so long for us to see that what we've lived with is a farce. You have to point to these examples to remind us, all right. So the embalming example comes into the first chapter. It's happening at the same time as the Caucasian War is taking place. And reports are coming to light saying there's no such thing as whiteness there at all.
And this was important because in the 19th century, there were many white Christians who believed that heaven was segregated and that only white people were allowed into heaven. So they were like, okay, but if I'm black, am I going to get into heaven?
Yeah.
I hate the joke, but that's literally, I think, what some people were thinking.
That's right. And even, okay, you'll love this. So the Caucasus region has this warrior priest that even Woodrow Wilson writes about in his history of American life and history, Shamil. When it's seen to be the Caucasus region, this homeland of whiteness, even though he's an imam, he's Muslim, he's called this warrior priest. He's given this Christian halo. He's actually described, his turban is described as a halo of extraordinary sanctity. He's associated with Christianity. As soon as the region's revealed to be totally heterodox, not white at all, he's called Muslim, he's called an imam. You see it in the reports, and it's a distancing. So there's also these different associations of the whiteness you're pointing out that drop by the wayside about the Caucasus region too.
So I think some of you had some questions I'd like to ask, if that's okay.
Sure, please, yes.
Could you speak to a moment/challenge in your perspective paths that help you to find your focus? What experiences have helped you find your voices?
Love that. Well, I think there are many. For the sake of this conversation, I would say two. I don't mean to embarrass Ibram, but there's so many different ways in which I want to salute your work. But when I read Stamp from the beginning, I first thought, we owe you such a debt of gratitude for withstanding the painful aspects of the American past, staying with it long enough to put it down as a book, and thought, well, to myself, when I read it, I thought, well, if he has the fortitude to do this, I have to be courageous enough to put down on the page these fictions that we've lived with. So seeing your work, finding fellowship before we'd even met, was a way through the challenge of fear, I think, that accompanies anyone doing work connected to justice. The other, I'm not sure if the person is a writer, if they're looking for ways around, but I think it's important to trust the winks and nudges you get from the beyond, from the universe. There are moments in the book when I'm writing about things that came up in the archive, and I still can't even understand how it fell into my lap, but it did. And those are the moments, I think, when I find myself knowing that I'm being like accompanied on the journey, and that accompaniment gives me a reminder of the broader purpose, right, of the work. So it's exciting, and less daunting in those moments. Yeah, that's what I would say. What about you? Are there ways?
Oh, I think for me, I think what we essentially should be doing as scholars is learning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And being challenged, and challenging our sort of way of, to use your frame, seeing. And in many ways, I think it's been those times in which a piece of scholarship, a conversation, a book like this allowed me to see the world in new ways that then caused me to want to continue to see it in new ways. I felt like it's almost like this journey of constant clarity. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? And I think that's what has long sort of guided me. I just want to have a more clearer sense of not only the world but even myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's our aim as writers, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I heard you traveled to the Caucasus Mountains with Nell Painter. That must have been fun. Why Nell? And what insights did you discover being in person?
Okay.
And this is from, shout out to Nicole.
Nicole. Oh, great. Nell Painter. Do you know Nell Painter? Okay, now, this extraordinary historian, formerly at Princeton, she is the author of the biography of Sojourner Truth, the history of white people, Old in Art School, the list goes on. She is a mentor, friend, and the only person who'd go with me to the Caucasus Mountains right before the pandemic. I mean, it's kind of a wild thing to say to someone, do you want to go with me to, sorry, see if we can find the homeland of whiteness. That's basically what we did. So, oh my goodness, I'm laughing because we had some real adventures on this trip. And it was before the pandemic, and thank God we could do it then. But it came about because in a talk sort of like this, a work in progress talk at NYU, I delivered the material, but before sitting down, half an hour before, a group of pretty stern looking folks came, and I thought, oh gosh, what is happening here? Asked them if they wanted to maybe come back when it started. They came back, and it turns out that they were a group of men and women based in New Jersey from the Caucasian diaspora. They were actual Caucasians living in the United States.
Say that again.
They were actual Caucasians from the Caucasus
No offense
Mountains.
to the fake Caucasians.
Sorry, Dave. Yeah, exactly. Unless anyone else is also from the Caucasus Mountains here, none of y'all are from there. But they had been tracing my work for years. And I was up at Yale doing the PhD, and they finally stopped looking so stern at me when I began to speak about the genocide of their ancestors and the Caucasian War, and had come to thank me for cleaving their own history, which has been forgotten and buried, from racial ideology that we've created around it today. They came, they presented me with this flag, this Circassian flag, this green flag with these gold stars, and then sent me this flash drive with all of the material that they have amassed about their homeland and about the war and its aftermath. At that point, I thought I was done with the book. I had to stop and start again, in effect. Wait a minute. What do I have here? They had amassed what it had taken me 10 years to amass, but the stakes changed, When it came from them, I realized, well, this is actually a living group of people here. Okay, I can't just write the book as if it's an ideology and a concept alone. So I had to go. Or they kind of made it so easy in a way that I could not go. They activated the entire Caucasian diaspora, like Istanbul, Georgia. I went to places literally that were not on Google Maps, so I had to go to the library. Look.
So you told your friends you were hanging out with Caucasians?
Yeah, I said, Nell Painter and I are going to talk about the myth of the Caucasian ideal to actual Caucasians. We're going to blow their minds, and we did. So few people knew there about how we've used the image of their region and the term to go hear this system we live with today. It changed my life, that trip. It thank God I was able to go. Thank God for Nell Painter, because I would not have done that on my own. It did require some trust, but what a journey. Yeah, thank you.
And it's interesting because it causes me to because you're describing the ways in which this land and the people who lived there were in a way captured by racial theorists. And I think something similar has happened in recent weeks with Springfield, Ohio.
Yeah, that's
in
right.
which that land and those people have been captured
Yes.
by racial theorists. Am I thinking about that right?
I think that's right. I think the term capture is so critical here because there's an idea of it being of a people being locked in the imagination, right? The question is what's going to break it free. I just want to show connected to this idea, just one picture. It's just you know it. Langston Hughes Nell Painter and I went to the Caucasus Mountain region, but people had done this before. Langston Hughes goes, there's a film he's associated with, and it kind of went bust. So he ends up traveling in the Caucasus Mountain region. And he finds himself with people who look nothing like the representation of whiteness, and he's startled by it. He starts to write about it. He describes the men and women there as dark as russet pears and as brown as chocolate. He's just so in many ways we were tracing the steps of those who also understood that we have been captured, right, by an idea that is utterly incorrect about the look of the globe.
Another question. I like how you described as a detective of history, uncovering hidden truths. But I teach middle schoolers who have never heard of the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, I'm turning the page, don't worry. How do we get our youths interested in the history of their people, their ancestors at all?
Oh, well, I'd love to speak to the person who asked the question more. One-on-one as an educator, I think there are lots of different tactics. And I'd love to know more about the demographic, what type of students you're teaching. I'd need to do that to answer the question sufficiently with nuance. But I think one way to animate the imagination, and as it relates to the unseen truth, there are lots of ways to teach about racial history, is to remind students, that we do live with untruths, with fictions, with lies. And they know at that age what's wrong with a lie, what's wrong with a fiction, and that we're all now collectively part of the work of undoing those in society. And then point to the case studies that make this clear. It was most, I think, gripping for me to, in the chapter of the book on maps, look at how we used to teach racial history in the United States. Should I show one of the maps?
Please.
Okay, so I halted the book
I have the worst seat in the house.
Oh yeah, I can move my chair. Oh, okay. So at the turn of the 20th century, in any class in the United States, segregated schools, maps like these were part of required instruction. Geography was a way of teaching history. Maps at the time had often a legend at the bottom that just naturalized the idea of white racial superiority. You see often at the very center the man representing the Caucasian race as larger, as certainly centered. Here, the atlas that would have been used not only in schools, but also circulating in homes. This is one of the most popular atlases at the turn of the 20th century, the People's Illustrated. The Caucasian race is at the very top, just surmounting everyone. The diagram makes clear what the message is. And at the time, by the way, the Circassian girl is on the left. So the myths that we're talking about were seen as fact at the time. But what starts to emerge on these maps is a complete evacuation of the fictions, but a maintenance of the racial regime. This example I love because W.B. Du Bois, when he critiques how educators are focused on racial regimes, he has this idea that the weather, that the natural occurrences of the weather are how people are teaching racial history, as if racial domination is just a bit like the air. No one's the cause of it. So these maps give you a sense of why he had to do that work. But I think the one that probably is the most, it's harder to see from the back, but if you can see from the front, most startling is this. This is a map that the federal government supported in the use of schools all around the United States, and it centralizes whiteness to the point where everyone else is lifted off the globe entirely at the edges of the frame. So the teaching in schools of world history through these tactics, these visual regimes, made it quite easy to cohere these fictions. So even just presenting to your students, depending on the age, representations of how they would have been taught 100 years ago starts to give you a vivid sense of the narrative correction work we need to do today. Yeah.
And we're going to 8? Or
he said we do 5 after because we start in the left.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you end the book with talking about that it takes so long for us to see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And why do you think that's so?
There are a number of reasons. I love the way that you frame that question. I think there's a near machine at work in cohering racial myths, such that it takes time that we're conditioned to believe we don't have, to do the work of excavation to find the truth. I'll give you an example, and this is what ends the book. Here in Washington National Cathedral, a president is buried on the ground floor. I'm not sure if you can guess which one. I was surprised when I learned which one. I was invited to go to National Cathedral to speak on a panel with others celebrating a new set of stained glass windows meant to replace the Confederate stained glass windows, those dedicated to Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Carrie James Marshall created these stained glass windows. Elizabeth Alexander created the tablets beneath. So, I don't live in DC. I didn't have a lot of, not often in DC, didn't have a lot of time, and thought, okay, I'll come in, I'll come out. The efficiency model, lack of time, American life. Something told me, just take a tour of the cathedral. You want to know a little more about the context. Took more time. The canon of the cathedral walked me through, and I stopped right before we got to the Carrie James Marshall windows. Why? Because I saw that there was a tomb right next to it, and it was a tomb of Woodrow Wilson. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many of you knew this? No. 1, 2. So his tomb is on the ground floor right next to the chairs for worship in the nave, not in the crypt below. It was brought up after he was initially in Bethlehem Chapel. And I stood and felt as if I was seeing, a metaphor to answer your question. It takes so long to see. Right? How many decades have gone by since the 1950s when his tomb was installed there? How many decades have gone by and no one has noted this? No one has noted the signaling force of the windows dedicated to his regime, sitting right next to worshipers in a church that was meant to be and is for all of the people, deliberately sited on a part of DC that could rival the height of the Capitol. The contradictions embedded in his placement. This is also a place of worship that invited Martin Luther King Jr. a week before he was assassinated, spoke in that pulpit, and then a week later would find that his life was being celebrated after his funeral. This is it's an ecumenical space and had quite progressive leaders, still does. I went back to my hotel room that day, and the hearings regarding January 6th proceedings were taking place. And it seemed to me that both that event, seeing Woodrow Wilson's tomb and the time it took for me to do so, and those hearings were asking us what it will take to finally see what's in front of us. That what we saw was what we saw, this insurrection, right? Oh, I thought she was I thought there was a cosign as if we were in church in the background. Yes, it takes so long to see. But that line, "it takes so long to see," was what the canon said to me as I stood there, and he just felt my silence and what I was saying to myself. There, the art historian, right, realizing what I hadn't seen, what no one had written about. He said, as if kind of giving me this sort of proverbial pat on the back, "it takes so long to see," so wise, right? And it really was encouraging me and all of us, as I write in the book, to lean into those moments of tension that force us to extend our gaze, right, with endurance, to dwell in those moments that speak to the unspeakable, really, in American life, right?
Definitely, and certainly it helps if we can just slow down a little bit. And I just want to encourage everyone, after you get this book, to read it slowly. I got in and I was just reading it quickly, and then I had to slow down. I'm like, I'm not going to get this. I really need to take my time with it. And so I just want to encourage everyone, as you read this book, to really sort of take your time with Sarah's scholarship, with her insight. And I just want to thank you for this conversation today, and for this wonderful book.
Thank you so much. What an honor. What an honor. Thank you.